Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to another reaction video. Today we are diving back into the continuing saga that is the Franke family. Now, as you all probably know, a few months ago, one of Franke's children escaped from being imprisoned in Jodi Hildebrandt's house. Jodi Hildebrandt is the erstwhile therapist for the Franke family and also Ruby Franke's business partner. Together they had created a huge platform for teaching parents how to parent well. And in hindsight, obviously, that did not work out so well. And so there's been a lot of continuing drama between past victims of Hildebrandt coming out of the woodwork to talk about how her unethical practices have harmed them, and a lot of discourse about the partnership between Hildebrandt and the LDS Church. But one thing that was conspicuously absent in the initial findings was, where was the father in all of this? And so there's been other news that's come out about Kevin Franke, but now what we see in this video update today is that he apparently is filing for divorce in the midst of this child abuse case. So we're going to be diving into that today. Before I dive into the reaction, please make sure you like and subscribe. That way you can make sure that you're not missing any of these reaction videos or any of the other videos that I'm putting out that are about mental health and how you can advocate for yourself when you're seeking mental health care. I'm also wearing some of our new merch, so go ahead and check out the store. It should be linked below in the description, or just check out the merch shelf under the video. It fits well, it's comfortable, and I've been excited to be able to wear something out, to be able to rep the brand, rep the channel. So now's the time to check out the store. We've got more than just shirts. We've got mugs, stickers, hats, joggers. Find the best fit for you to be able to rep the brand. Now let's dive into the video.
Welcome to Connexions. I'm Jodi Hildebrandt. And I'm Ruby Franke.
Kevin Franke files for divorce from his wife, accused child abuser Ruby Franke, and is also petitioning a state lawmaker to make sure Utah does a better job of weeding out untrained counselors. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber.
So one of the things that I learned early on when I started covering the Ruby Franke case is that apparently Kevin Franke was almost kicked out of the house at the direction of Jodi Hildebrandt, who was acting as the family's therapist. Now, when we're talking about untrained therapists, Hildebrandt had actually gone through all the proper channels to be practicing. She was practicing in the capacity that she was licensed for. She was a licensed counselor. She was a licensed counselor in Utah. And just one of the main problematic things was that she was in this kind of partnership with the LDS Church, where bishops would refer families over to her, and she would have kind of carte blanche, just free reign to be able to tell these families whatever they wanted. And what I've heard from a lot of commenters is that even though her teachings and the things that she said sound really crazy to us, that they weren't completely out of line with the teachings of the LDS Church, which is why she continued to get referrals, continued to have the support of the church, even as, according to a lot of the victims, a lot of the husbands were alienated in this process.
Well, she is best known for her now defunct family YouTube channel called 8 Passengers. But accused child abuser Ruby Franke spent the last few years working with her business partner and co-defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt, on a business organization called Connexions. Franke and Hildebrandt, they offered advice on everything from relationships and parenting to intimacy and self-improvement, styling themselves as life coaches. They offered classes through their website and often posted their videos on YouTube and Instagram.
I love anger only when it's used in truth. Only in truth. And obviously you can have very clear, motivating anger inside truth. And unfortunately, most of us don't know how to do that. That when we feel anger, it predominantly goes into this place of distortion.
So one of the things, I'm not here to review Hildebrandt's videos. I know most people feel that she's discredited now, but anytime a therapist is marketing themselves as having this kind of unique knowledge that you can't get from anyone else, that's a little more than just therapy. That's a little cultish. So just a red flag to be looking out for if someone's saying that you can only get this from me. Unless it's a highly specific intervention that requires a lot of postgraduate training that a lot of people just don't have, that might be a little different. But if she's claiming to have some kind of secret knowledge that, oh, nobody else knows how to do this, red flag.
If you go into loving yourself, but you're not principled about it, you're going to slip, you're going to hurt yourself. That's where it goes into the selfishness. You have to have the principles with the soul in order for it to be self-love.
Well, now, today, Franke and Hildebrandt are each charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse with respect to 2 of Franke's youngest children. The kids were found in Hildebrandt's home in Ivins, Utah. The son actually escaped from the home, ran to a neighbor, telling him to call 911. The boy was emaciated. He had wounds like he had been tied up. The daughter was found in similar condition. They were both treated for malnourishment at a hospital. Really terrible, terrible story. And knowing that, it's easy to see that some of the women's advice in a whole new light.
One way to know if your child is managing what is on their plates is to ask, is my child showing up cheerful? Is my child showing up responsible? Is my child available if I ask her to do something like, hey, could you wash up the dishes for me? Hey, would you mind taking out the garbage? Are they available to say, yeah, sure, Or are they pushing back? I don't have time. I can't do that. That tells you they're not managing. Because
this is really tricky here. Again, I'm not here to review all of their videos and all the samples that are in this video. I don't have a problem with kids doing chores. I have a problem with parents using that as a test, asking them to do chores, not because the kids should contribute to the running of the household, but just because, ooh, let me ask them to do this so I can see where they're at, if they're emotionally available, if they're making themselves available for me. That's a problematic dynamic between parent and child.
someone who's managing has time and space and motive for serving those around them.
Now, here is the thing. While Jodi Hildebrandt did at one point seem to have a license as a, quote, mental health counselor in Utah, after her arrest, she ended up actually agreeing to give up her therapy license. Franke's title of, quote, certified mental fitness trainer on the Connexions website was likely less accurate. And
I have never heard of a certified mental health fitness expert. I don't even know. That's a mouthful. When it comes to these licenses and certificates, they're all over the place now. Pretty much every training that I end up doing, there's an option to upgrade so that you can be a certified expert in whatever you just learned about. If you are looking for a therapist or a counselor of some kind, for the most part, try to focus on the state licenses. That means they have been through the proper state sanctioned process to be trained and to be practicing as a mental health professional. Now, obviously, as we see with the Hildebrandt case, that's not a sure sign that the person is going to be a good therapist. But in terms of just searching through the mass amounts of certifications and different licenses, focus on the licenses that are granted by the states, because those are standardized by each state. Those are publicly available for you to look up.
And that is raising some concern in the state of Utah, and perhaps there is going to be a change. To talk more about this, I want to bring on our expert on Ruby Franke. And following all aspects of this case from the very beginning, we are joined once again by Brian Schnee, anchor reporter from KUTV2 News. Brian, so good to see you. Thanks so much for coming back on here.
The way this conversation is going, I feel like the husband filing for divorce was just the hook to get me into this video. But we'll see if they touch on that again at some point.
Thanks for having me. Excited to always talk about developments as we see them come out in this case.
Now, Brian, I understand there's also been a big development with respect to Kevin Franke, right?
Today, November 29th, Kevin Franke filed in the state of Utah for divorce, as we understand it. And it was filed actually in the 4th District Court. And the petition for divorce is private, so we can't see a whole lot of it. But we do know that things were filed today here in the state of Utah.
So we don't know the reason for the divorce. I mean, we can assume, but we don't know the actual legal filing, the reason for it.
Domestic relations injunction outlining certain measures to govern the conduct of both parties involved. That is about all I see on it. There are different parts of the injunction that...
Okay, so lawyers who are in the comments, let me know what this all means. It looks like, from what I can see, is that this is a legal order for both parties to be acting a certain way. You know, I'm not a lawyer. I could be wrong about that. So let me know.
That include some prohibitions against harassment, domestic violence, misuse of personal information. So Franke filing for divorce today with not a lot of information, as that petition itself is private, but we're just learning about this right now as of today here on the 29th.
And Brian, when you hear about that, I mean, we just talked about how the idea is how he's petitioning now for a change in the law so that, people have the right qualifications to give this kind of advice, seemingly turning on his wife and Jodi Hildebrandt, or I should say maybe ex-wife, because he's now filing for divorce. This is consistent, I feel, from what we've heard from his lawyer, correct? And what with the position I think he's been taking, that he had no idea what was going on with Ruby Franke and the kids. I'm not surprised he filed for divorce.
Yeah, I don't think it's surprising. I just tried to trade some messages with Randy Kester earlier this week just to see if anything new was happening. And he told me, no, nothing's on the way here. And then, of course, this drops today. So this is interesting. And I think it shows that Kevin further wants to not only distance himself from Ruby, but also sort the situation out in juvenile court and figure out what to do with the kids.
Let's tackle.
Yeah, that's going to be very tricky. Because, at least in the comments that I've seen on previous videos, people are split between whether Kevin Franke is culpable for what was happening to the kids. Like, he should have been more involved, or he should have known. And then others saying that he was a victim of Hildebrandt's divide and conquer kind of counseling technique, where she seems to always be on the side of the woman and alienating the husband from the household, as evidenced by him being out of the house for multiple months before this whole case kind of broke. But then I guess it depends on the judge's read of the situation, whether Kevin was contributing to the problems or whether he was an innocent victim as well.
Here. So this concerns my understanding. And first of all, I should tell you that it was your network that kind of broke this news, that Utah State Senator David Hinkins told your network, your outlet, that he has spoken with Ruby Franke's estranged husband, Kevin, about the qualifications, the certifications of Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt. Walk us through that.
First and foremost, some great reporting by my colleague Paul Nelson here at KUTV. He was working on Capitol Hill, looking at a number of different bills that are being worked on in sessions as they get preparing for a legislative session as we get to the new year. And he's been talking to people up there at the state capitol. And one of the things he had heard is that they're working on a bill, at least one state senator is, into looking at life coaches or people that kind of fit that mold. And indeed, apparently this came from some concerns from Kevin Franke. And it's interesting to note, the state senator here that's working on this bill, very beginning stages, I should say, no traction on it, no language in it as we understand, but an idea, right? Maybe starting to put pen to paper. He had not even really heard about this case as it seemed. So this came from, right. So that's what my reaction was to this. Kevin Franke.
Historically, life coaches and that kind of nebulous area where you're not quite a counselor, but you might end up being kind of in that therapist counselor role for people, has been very tricky because that's not a standardized certification. It just depends on whatever company you're ending up certified with. And so that allows people who have not had the prerequisite kind of education and training to fall into this life coach role where they're providing pseudo therapy and where they might be very helpful for people, but then you also don't have much recourse to be able to sort through who's good and who's bad in the same way that if you have a state license. So that is something to pay attention to. For people who have been through school, been through residency, and have their license, they are going to display that proudly. They are going to make sure that you know that they're licensed, and your license has to be clearly visible or at least available for your clients to be able to see if they ask for it. So these are all kinds of safety checks to try to make sure that someone's not misrepresenting their level of training, their level of expertise, and their ability to work in potentially very sensitive and vulnerable positions.
Franke reaches out to this state senator and says, hey, we need to look into this. And he even pointed to the part where, it ripped apart his marriage. You have to imagine that is involving Franke and Hildebrandt's relationship. So it's almost like this goes back to Jesse Hildebrandt a little bit more than it does Ruby Franke.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. So Jessie Hildebrandt, the niece of Jodi Hildebrandt, had an opportunity to interview them, talked about the abuse that they suffered at the hands, allegedly, at Jodi Hildebrandt. But walk us through, I mean, the idea here, before we even get into the state of Utah and what is required or not required of these kinds of instructors, the idea that Kevin would approach this state senator, are you surprised by that?
I am. I also don't know what the timeline looked like of when exactly this happened. I would imagine it's relatively recent, given the fact that lawmakers are starting to meet at the Capitol and go through the process of drafting bills and making change. And obviously, there's a large process after you even put the language out there. But it's interesting to know that this comes from inside the family to want to make a big change here in Utah about what is qualified and what needs to be put out there to coach people on their lives.
And let's talk about that. So in Utah, to be this kind of life coach, are there any qualifications?
No, the Division of Professional Licensing here in Utah, we refer to them as DOPL. And we've covered them before when talking about Hildebrandt's license being suspended many years ago. So DOPL is involved in the licensing for clinical, mental health and other therapists, which is what Jodi had a license for way back when. But DOPL has never had any sort of restriction on a life coach being licensed in Utah. There's no standards for that industry here in the state.
Just to touch on that really quick, this actually turned into a lot more about counselor identity than I had imagined. But if I remember right, and again, lawyers, go ahead and let me know in the comments, terms like counselor or professional counselor or licensed counselor or marriage and family therapist, at least from Virginia, those are protected terms. Legally protected, that means you cannot claim to be those things if you do not have the qualifications. And so as an example of that, when I was a resident, I could not call myself a counselor. I was a resident in counseling, and that was a separate protected title. So that made it very clear what level of training I've gone through, what level of education I have, and where I'm at in the professional process. And now to be able to call myself a counselor implies that I've gone through residency, I've passed the prerequisite tests, I've done the education and the training, and I am licensed by the state of Virginia to practice independently. If all of those things are not true, legally I cannot call myself a counselor.
And you'd be hard-pressed to find many states, as far as we understand it, here in the country where life coaches have to have those standards put out there for their clients to understand. So the big thing we took away from this, Jesse, was if you're seeking a life coach, you better do your homework.
And I guess the reason was, and I was reading about this, is they don't want to create too many requirements because there are people who could help their family members or their friends. And if you put too much of a stringent requirement in place, it might impact that. I mean, does that make sense to you? Because that's what I saw.
It doesn't surprise me here in Utah that they wouldn't want to add more requirements. It's just kind of how things have been, at least in my experience since I've been here. However, the bills that are being drafted on Capitol Hill here, I feel like are more on current issues. Now, this is not as much of an issue, I think, as it is a very large play given this case, right? There's a lot of talk about life coaches now and what this mental fitness sort of coach looks like. So it doesn't surprise me that it's coming to light. It did surprise me that it's coming from Kevin Franke, apparently. That's where it's coming from. So it's interesting that the state senator is willing to look into it, first and foremost, which if you live here in the state and someone is your elected official, then you want to obviously have someone advocate for you on a larger scale. But it's using this high-profile case where two people are still incarcerated and in custody over child abuse allegations and charges. And that's where this bill comes from. And again, no language on paper yet, but it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. And it's my understanding that Senator Hinkins would like to work with the Division of Professional Licensing here in Utah to get this done. And DOPL said, we don't want to comment on this until that bill is drafted.
That's interesting, but he makes a good point. The reason for the licensing is so that when you go to see a professional of some kind that has a license, doctor, dentist, counselor, you know the minimum standard of training and experience that they have. You can expect that because they have that official state-sanctioned title. When you have a life coach, that at least in Utah, it could be different in other states, but at least in Utah, he's saying there are no regulations around that. You don't know what you're getting. You could be getting someone great. You could be getting someone who is in that position to try to abuse it. And that's true in counseling as well, but you also have a minimum standard of competency when it comes to counseling that is not necessary when it comes to these nebulous terms like life coach or mental fitness expert or coach or whatever it is.
Well, few things there. So first of all, I'll say with Kevin Franke, you know, doing this or allegedly contacting this state senator kind of shows how he feels about his wife and kind of feels how he feels about Jodi Hildebrandt and what they were doing. Now, the Utah Division of Professional Licensing said, quote, life coaches are not required to be licensed in Utah. Therefore, there are no standards for the industry. There are a few national life coach consortiums that have some standards, but none that are enforceable in Utah yet. We do see some complaints that are against life coaches who are former licensed behavioral health practitioners who lost a license and are now practicing as life coaches, but are providing the same services as when they were licensed, which is illegal.
I didn't even think about that. That's a big deal. If you lose your license as a counselor, that means you are not supposed to provide counseling services anymore. But then these people apparently would rebrand as life coaches and then go on doing the same thing. Except now they probably can't accept insurance, so they're probably just taking cash directly from their clients, which probably ends up being more harmful in terms of the cost to the client. But yeah, that's definitely problematic. I didn't even think that that was what was going on.
So everybody knows, Brian, what are the complaints about Connexions? I mean, there were former clients who came out and said that what was going on was a problem, right? What do we know about the former clients of Connexions, the former clients of Franke and Hildebrandt?
Well, a lot of this stems from the people that we've spoken to over the last few months that have their own personal story to share. And I want to make sure we clarify, all these stories are really about Jodi Hildebrandt. They're not about Ruby Franke. Franke's a different part of this piece. So this is talking about Connexions Classroom and the types of tactics that were used. A lot of them, of course, focusing on making one individual in a relationship feeling guilty or feeling like they've had some sort of wrongdoing. A lot of this becomes sexual in nature or has to do with separating the couple to find this common goal. And ultimately, what we've heard is Hildebrandt's tactics ruined marriages compared to what you would want from a therapist or somebody trying to get you through those tough times, which would be bringing you together. It's almost as though she ripped couples apart, as far as what we understand.
And we saw that when I reacted to, I think it was Matthew Della Ripa, and he said that he recognized very early on that Hildebrandt's separating couples, while she may have sincerely believed that was the way to get to healing, also made a lot of extra money for her because then she would be seeing them separately. So those are two separate sessions she's billing for. They would go to men's groups and women's groups, so that's another source of income, and then et cetera, et cetera. So she's creating multiple revenue streams out of one family. And in addition to just abusing her position, that's not the way you go about marriage counseling.
Trey Warner was an interesting person who I believe spoke to KUTV. He said that he was made to believe that, or was told that, men, if they have impure thoughts, they're a danger to their families, right?
And that is the same thing that other people said to me. That reporting about Trey Warner from the same individual, my colleague here, Paul Nelson, who brought this story to us too. So great reporting by Paul all the way around to get this part of what happens next after this case on a larger scale, after talking to people like Trey. And Trey was very early on. I'm thinking week 1 or week 2 after we heard about the arrest. Trey was one of the early individuals to speak with us about what Jodi Hildebrandt was doing to her clients, ripping them apart, forcing the man to separate, and ultimately creating this natural divide, it seemed, instead of, again, bringing people together.
So just before we wrap this up, I want to talk one more time about the Ruby Franke aspect. You know, you talked about how Jodi Hildebrandt, her former client's not too happy with her services. Well, going back to Senator Hinkins, he said, quote, "Right now, there's nothing regulating. They can tell people to do anything they want and there's no recourse. I think that those that are professing to be life coaches should have some type of a criteria that they need to some credibility." And then I believe he said in terms of Franke's title as a certified mental fitness trainer, it's just a title that somebody could make up and makes it sound professional when it's really probably not.
And that pretty much sums up the argument for why there might be some regulation. And as they were talking about before, I've got no problem if like you've got a cousin or an uncle or like a family member who you trust and you know has your best interests at heart, and you're bouncing ideas off of them, getting advice and feedback from them. Maybe you've got a family member or a sponsor who you trust to be giving you advice and helping you get your life back on course and in the direction that you want to move. I mean, that's one of the tenets of AA. But when you start charging for those services, then the opportunity to take advantage of people grows exponentially. That's why I think right now I'm leaning more towards the idea of like, let's have some kind of basic regulation, or if there are national organizations, maybe the state picks a couple of those that they vet to say you need to be certified with one of these organizations in order to be practicing as a life coach. But again, like Senator Hinkins is saying, you could still make up your own title that's just a blending of multiple buzzwords, and then there'd be no regulation because you're not one of those protected terms.
Do you have any evidence or any kind of reporting about the problems in Ruby Franke's counseling? Obviously, with what she's accused of and what she professed through Connexions and her videos, we can come up and say something's not adding up. But have you heard any complaints directly about Ruby Franke?
No, most of it's on Jodi Hildebrandt, and again on online comments or reviews or the people that have spoken to us about this, but none about Ruby's practice, so to say, about what she's listed as on the Connexions Classroom website. So a lot of that is speculative, I think, right now, of trying to figure out, have people seen her for counseling? What did she really do with people? What sort of advice was she giving? How was she coaching these individuals? A lot of that still hasn't come to light yet.
Brian Schnee, you can check him out on KUTV2 News. Excellent reporting as always, and also just a call out to your colleague as well for this great reporting on this kind of tangential topic. But, you know, now with the divorce happening, I'm sure we're going to get a lot more updates as they come, and we'd love to have Brian you back on here on Sidebar to talk about it.
Well, so that turned into a lot more about counseling identity and regulation than I imagined it would. It was just like a couple of minutes on the divorce piece, but I guess there's not that much information on that yet. So stay tuned. We'll be sure to be following that as details come out, if they do come out. Now, I think a lot of the conversation was still really helpful to be able to talk about why are these licenses so important? Why is regulation important? Because as we see, there's a lot of potential for there to be abuse if there is no oversight. Now, again, that doesn't stop a specific person who is set in their intention to do harm, like Jodi Hildebrandt, like we saw with Peyton Shires, and other therapists who are just out there with the intention to abuse their position. That doesn't keep that from happening, but for the average person, that helps you to be able to sort through as you're navigating a really complicated mental health care landscape. Who are the people who have done the minimum amount of training and I can count on to at least know the basic stuff to be able to serve me in the way that I need? So I think that is very helpful to have that conversation. Again, thank you all so much for checking out this video. Please like and subscribe so you can stay up to date with the channel, what we're doing. Like I said, a lot of exciting things happening. We've opened up the merch store recently, so please go ahead and check that out. Subscribe so that you can keep up with all of the videos that we're putting out as well. We do live streams every week, so tune into the community tab to see the announcements for when those live streams come up. We talk about a bunch of different topics. And so like I said, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time.